This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. On September 22nd, the Truss government introduced a new law to Parliament. The retained EU Law, Revocation and Reform Bill. This bill, which was dreamt up by the Johnson government back in January and has since been sponsored by Jacob Rees-Mogg, would basically get rid of thousands of so-called retained EU laws, which the government copied and pasted into UK law way back in 2018 as part of the EU withdrawal bill, in order to avoid any accidental gaps in the statute book. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the bill which plans to scrap all of them, some of the implications, and why it's probably not a good idea to suddenly get rid of thousands of laws just because they're from the EU. So, let's start by taking a look at the bill itself. To understand the bill, you'll need to know a bit about the EU Withdrawal Act of 2018. Basically, this bill copied and pasted all EU laws that had been passed before 2018 into UK law, and gave them supremacy over any pre-existing pieces of UK legislation. Now, this might sound a bit weird, but in practice, it just maintained the status quo. Prior to Brexit, the UK had followed these EU laws, and they had supremacy over other pre-existing UK laws. So the Withdrawal Act basically just kept things exactly the same. Now, this was necessary because there were literally thousands of EU laws that the UK acknowledged pre-Brexit. So the Theresa May government realised that if they scrapped them all immediately, then this would leave tons of holes in the British statute book. Now, that might sound extreme, but the implications of scrapping thousands of pieces of legislation in one swoop are genuinely so massive that no one could really foresee them. So, if this were to happen, it would immediately introduce an untenable degree of uncertainty into the UK's legal system, which would be good for no one. Nonetheless, that is exactly what the EU Retained Law Bill plans to do. According to Section 1 of the bill, all retained EU laws and EU-derived subordinate legislation, which is basically a fancy way of saying any UK legislation that was intended to make the UK's laws consistent with EU treaties, would be revoked at the end of 2023. Now, ministers of the relevant departments can preserve these retained EU laws if they need them, which might require them to copy and paste them into new UK statutes. And for the laws that they're not sure if they need, they can ask for an extension until the 23rd of June 2026 at the latest. But unless they copy and paste or defer the deadline, the laws will be scrapped. On top of that, the bill would also end the so-called supremacy of any preserved law that remained on the statute book after 2030. Now, as we mentioned a second ago, retained EU law was given so-called supremacy because pre-Brexit, EU laws trumped UK laws. And this was basically just a way of maintaining legal continuity and thereby reducing legal uncertainty. It's also worth mentioning that these retained EU laws didn't have supremacy over any new UK legislation. Any act passed after 2018 could overwrite EU retained law. It just had supremacy over old UK legislation because that's how it worked in the 40 years or so when the UK was part of the EU. Anyway, the government have claimed that this bill is a good idea because EU retained law was never intended to sit on the statute book indefinitely, and it will, quote, reclaim the sovereignty of Parliament and restore primacy to Acts of Parliament. The Truss government also claimed that the bill, which was released the day before their ill-fated plan for growth, would help the UK to, quote, fully realise the opportunities of Brexit and support the unique culture of innovation in the UK. Perhaps unsurprisingly though, the retained EU law bill hasn't gone down brilliantly with, well, anyone else. For starters, both the Scottish and Welsh devolved assemblies have criticised it for its constitutional implications. Not only does the bill leave little space for parliamentary scrutiny of a few thousand relevant pieces of legislation, but given that assimilation is up to the ministers' decisions, it also undermines the Sewell Convention. The Settle Convention essentially says that Westminster will consult with the devolved assemblies when it plans to legislate on matters of devolved competence. And given that EU laws affect devolved policies in areas like environmental policy, the Settle Convention means that you'd expect Westminster to consult with both Holyrood and the Senedd before going ahead with the retained EU law bill. But at least according to both the Scottish Government and the Welsh Council General, this hasn't happened yet. Civil servants have also warned that sifting through thousands of pieces of EU legislation to figure out the implications of revoking them and deciding which bits to preserve will take thousands of hours of civil servants' time, which it's not clear that they can really afford. The business department, for example, have estimated that it would require 370 officials working for a whole year to sift through the 318 EU laws that relate to business legislation. As things stand, 77 people are working full-time on sifting through legislation, which means that there's no way they're going to have it all done by 2023. Elsewhere, other civil servants have estimated that sifting through 2,400 EU retained laws across all the departments identified in the government's EU retained law dashboard would take 6 years, assuming no extra hiring. So obviously the civil service is pretty busy already, not least because the UK is currently struggling through a cost of living crisis, and the government is trying to reduce civil service headcount by about 20%. So making them spend 6 years sifting through thousands of obscure rules just because they're related to the EU does seem a little bit silly. And the thing is that it'll probably take even longer than that, because last week researchers at the National Archives found another 1,400 pieces of EU law that the government had missed. Yep, you heard that right. The government wanted to sunset all EU laws, despite the fact that they weren't even aware of about a third of them. This is, to put it mildly, crazy. Revoking thousands of laws without spending the time to go through them, including over 1,000 they didn't even know existed, would introduce a truly untenable amount of uncertainty into the UK's legal system, which is supposed to be one of the best in the world. And this is the main criticism made by lawyers and businesses alike, that this bill will wreak chaos on the UK's legal system. And this is one of the main reasons we're doing this video. Not only will scrapping all of these EU laws create holes in the statute book, affecting everything from intellectual property to workers' rights, but it will also affect constitutionally significant pieces of legislation like the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Brexit deal itself in ways that are as yet unforeseen. Now, this kind of legal uncertainty is bad news in and of itself, but it will also discourage business investment, which is already lower than it was pre-Brexit. Now, to be clear, none of this is anti-Brexit bias. Even if you think the bill is good for the UK's post-Brexit sovereignty, it's clear that constitutional violations, limited civil service capacity, legal uncertainty, and low investment are bad whichever side of the Brexit aisle you're on. So if this bill is such a bad idea, then will it actually happen? Well, during the campaign, Sunak actually promised to review or repeal all 2,400 retained EU laws within just 100 days. It does seem that he's called on this idea since, and reports by the FT in late October suggest that he's no longer committed to creating a new Brexit delivery unit, and is also reconsidering the retained EU law bill. Nonetheless, Sunak is yet to actually scrap the bill, and whether he does will depend on whether he's got the political capital he needs to stand up to the hardcore Brexit right of the Conservative Party. And unfortunately for anyone who likes a functioning statute book, history suggests that the Brexit right usually get their way, which means that we could see arguably one of the most reckless laws to ever reach the floor of the House of Commons hit the statute book relatively soon. Now, this is obviously a live story, and if you want to be updated on as it plays out, then you should subscribe to the Daily Briefing, our show where we break down 4 stories you need to know about every single day. Now, you can watch that on the Daily Briefing YouTube channel, or you can listen by searching in your favorite podcast app. But if you want an extended version of the show, that's an extra 5 to 10 minutes every single day, and an ad-free experience, then you'll need to sign up to our streaming service, Nebula. There, you'll also find other exclusive TLDR videos, which will never come to YouTube, and all of our latest videos ad-free. Now, if that has you interested, then I've got some good news, because we've partnered with CuriosityStream, the home of some of the best documentaries online. Thanks to them, you can get both streaming services, CuriosityStream for the documentaries and Nebula for the bonus TLDR, for less than $15 a year. That's a wild deal, and a 26% discount on their already low price. So get yourself a ton of documentaries and exclusive content from your favorite creators, including the Daily Briefing Extended Edition, by signing up using the link below. Thanks for your support.